Welcome back to Glory in the Morning. Glory 1130 WECR here in Newland. And joining me this morning is Miss Beth Morris. And Beth, you've brought some company with you today. I know this ought to be a fun and interesting conversation for the folks here in Avery County. And this one's a history lesson for you folks out there today. So we want to disclaimer it by saying that this morning, because the topic, some of you don't need to get upset about it. We're talking about the history of this area, and this is previous Avery County. I guess this is early 1900s history, right?
Sure.
Well,
Thank you for that. Yes, I do have someone, a guest here today. His name is Alan Cook, and he will be teaching a class or sharing some stories in a class on July 20th at the Avery Learning Center. And his book is Moonshine, Murder, and Mountaineers. And there's some wild stories and just some research that he's done. And a lot of this information comes from the Mitchell-Avery County area. So, Alan, tell us a little bit about your book. What inspired this?
Thank you, Beth. Yeah, there was a time when we were the wildest county in America. And what inspired it was I was doing some family research, like everybody does. They're kind of curious where they came from. And I started reading a lot of headlines about this area. The turn of the century, Mitchell and Avery County was one county and encompassed that Tennessee border area, a lot of wilderness. And the headlines coming out of there was, well, I'll read you one. Famed for murders, wickedest county in the United States is in North Carolina, where shootings are the recreation of its desperate inhabitants. No other county in any state or territory of the Union has been the scene of more murders and homicides than Mitchell County in the remote western part of North Carolina adjoining the Tennessee line. And that's from the Kansas Agitator, folks, in 1900. Those type of headlines coming from the Old West, where you thought the gunfighters and the desperados were, well, no, that was back here in our mountains, and there's some really interesting tales.
We're getting a good reputation there, weren't we?
We were, we're a wild county, wild area, and that we're scenically wild, but we have a heritage of some independent folks, which I love, and I'm a part of that heritage. So when I write a book, you're getting it from the local perspective, not the you're a work in progress, you mountain folks. We want to fix you up. No, I'm writing it from my ancestors, and this is my folks. It made for some neat interest in history. So,
well, if you look at it though, NASCAR wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for this, right?
That's right. So they had to get those fast cars for some reason. So, there's a little bit of need to transport certain things and get them to the place you need to go.
In your book, there's some good stories about, I think it was an Avery County resident, and Aaron Wiseman. Can you tell us give us just a little sample of one of those stories about that person?
Yeah, sure. Talked a lot about Aaron Wiseman. He started out the book and then he ended the book because he had a tale that kind of encompassed this whole time period. The book starts out talking about and documenting a late night murder. And what happened was down on the river, as the locals call it, that's the North Toe over towards Plumtree Way, there was a illicit steal being ran, and it was by three partners. And that was a William Sneed, Calvin Snipes, and Aaron Wiseman. And these guys made some of the best product around. It was blackberry brandy and whatever you ordered, but they had them a good steal way back up in Henson's Creek. And what they would do is they had it down to a science. They had their buyers all set up, and they were making a lot of side money off that corn and those blackberries they picked until a guy by the name of Isaac Osborne stumbled on their steal. And him doing the right thing went to the cops. He went to the police. So the revenue officers came out, busted the steal. The moonshiners were mad, so had a lot of motive. A month later, in the middle of the night, Isaac Osborne gets a knock on the door, and he comes to the door. The dog's barking, and I got the old court documents, and they quote, he says, "Come on in, the dogs won't bark or bite you." So he comes to the door, and he tries to tell the person out there to come on in, and when he opens the door, he is shot and killed. It was tragedy, but there was a slight bit of a story there in that when he was shot, he fell over and his wife was in the bedroom, and she came in, and on the court documents, what she says is, "William, are you dead?" And he replies back, "Yes, I'm dead." And he died. But that was his last words, is he told his wife that he was dead. So it was documented on the court documents. I was like, that sounds like something that would happen. My wife, I'd be like, "Honey, are you dead?" And I was like, yeah, I'm dead, baby. I'm sorry.
And then she'd have to clean up the mess. So,
Yeah, sorry you have
go.
to clean up there. But no, but it was a story that led to the rumors that the area we live in was home to the greatest riot in American history. So a story that followed that was a lynch mob came to get Aaron Wiseman and Calvin Snipes at the Bakersville jail. Well, the officers at the jail wasn't going to let the lynch mob have justice. So there came a war of sorts, and it was a huge gun battle, and like 20 people were killed. Newspapers across the country carried these headlines: "War in Mitchell County, war in Bakersville, many killed as moonshiners and mob battle." Well, it turns out, to make a long story short, that it was a fake story from one of the newspaper reporters in Johnson City who lived in Mitchell County. Either he got bad information, or someone was playing a joke on him, or it may have happened and was covered up on a smaller scale. But we analyze all those documents in the book and all those stories that crossed the country and even were in Europe. So everybody for a while thought that we were the home of one of the greatest riots since the headline says since the battle at Little Bighorn. So we have some neat stories, and that was one of them. So Bakersville was home to the biggest fake story in American history.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's a badge to wear.
I'm just sitting here looking at it right now. Last night, a mob of 500 masked men entered the jail, took Calvin Snipes, a murderer, to a forest half a mile away and lynched him.
Yeah, that's what was going around the country. That was probably the Los Angeles Herald talking about that. So, that's what makes you want to look at these stories, is like, what were the people all around the country saying about little old Avery and Mitchell County? And it makes some neat history. And I documented it versus court documentations. And supposedly the writer to that article confessed and said he was his ideal was to play a joke on the country, and he felt like he did. Now,
yes.
Some of the motives is maybe he was tired of us mountain folks getting made fun of by the whole country, so he said, "I'm going to play a joke back on them." And
I'm going to show some muscle here, huh?
Yeah, it's like flex a little mountain muscle there on them. But yeah, anyways, that was one of my stories that started the book with Mr. Wiseman. And then he may have got off on that murder. He may not have committed it. So if your relatives are listening out there, I didn't cast judgment on them either way. But at the end of the story was Mr. Wiseman was involved in a family feud down off the mountain in Glen Alpine, where a doctor and a storekeeper got in a bad fight, and the storekeeper's son was killed in the fight. It was the Hennessy doctor was his name. So the court had an injunction, and at the end of the injunction, rumor was that the storekeeper hired a gunman from Avery County, and they said the gun for hire might have been Aaron Wiseman. So he happened to be there on the train the evening that the doctor got shot for a revenge killing, and they found him guilty of murder. But we end the book on the note that the governor pardoned him because they said he didn't murder this person. So we got some neat characters.
Maybe he
now,
had some friends from his product
Newland
days that helped.
Newland was named after his lawyer.
Oh,
So
okay.
this is all true stories, neat history. Now, that's just one of my stories. I've got stories about all kinds of different people. I talk about a place called the Devil's Den. I talk about mob lynchings, gunfights in the streets. And I know I've talked on Facebook with a lot of folks who said, you didn't get half the stories, Alan. So, there's a lot
So
of
there might
history.
be a part two.
There might be a part two. I don't
Awesome.
know. We'll see.
Good. So tell, where can people find this book at? Where's it located?
In
If they want to pick up a copy.
Yeah, in Avery County. Right now, I have them at Crossnore Drug Store and the Avery County Historic Museum. Now, in Mitchell County, I have them over at Dellinger's Gift Store, the Market on Oak. I think Spruce Pine Public Library's got them. Oh, by the way, this is being historically recognized. I'm not a Tar Heel fan. I went to NC State, so I'm a Wolfpack fan. But the North Carolina Library at Chapel Hill, the history library, has got our book on file. So we're kind of telling the history of our area. So it's really cool.
Some stories.
Yeah.
That's right. Good documentation there.
Yeah.
And it looks like you have another story about a Holland English that must have been pretty popular back in the day, too.
Holland English. I bet a lot of your grandparents heard this story if you're listening today. The Holland English story was about a man that was accused for murdering his wife up on Roaring Creek. Down in Frank is where this was all located. So in the area known as Frank, a guy and his estranged wife have a conversation. Well, that evening she doesn't come home, and a day later they have a search party out. This happened in 1894. So about a day later they find her dead in the river, and they're thinking, well, she drowns. But as regulations require, the coroner checked, and they found out that she had bruising around her neck, that she was strangled to death, and she was murdered. So goes the story of Holland English and the death of Ellen Carroll. Well, Holland comes in. They've been having marital issues, and he's very indignant and swears vengeance on the person that murdered his wife. At the time he does that, one of his cousins, Ellen English, says, now you can't be doing this stuff. You offered me $10 to push her in the river. And at that point, the whole room grabs Holland and takes him to the Bakersville jail. Remember, Bakersville was the county seat when Mitchell and Avery was one county. And Holland's swearing he didn't do it. But with that testimony of Ellen English saying she was offered $10 to kill the estranged wife, that's pretty hard testimony to overcome. So the public opinion was out. Well, about a week later, in the middle of the night, a knock comes on the jail door, and a lynch mob is outside. Well, that knock comes late at night. The jailer comes to the door, and the guy says, my name's Brown Burleson, and I've got a prisoner I need to take into the jail. And the jailer says, well, you don't sound like Brown Burleson. He goes, I'm Brown Burleson. It's cold. Let me in. So the jailer reluctantly cracks the door open and looks out in the street of Bakersville. And a lynch mob from over in North Toe around Plumtree has come over the mountain during the night, and the street was filled with people, as the testimony says. So he shuts the door real quick, and then they try to negotiate out a settlement for the prisoner. And the jailer says, you can't have Mr. English. And the lynch mob says, no, we're going to have him, or we're going to burn this jail down. And then another guy says, we're going to put dynamite under the jail and blow it up. Well, the jailer says, well, you just go ahead and do that. Well, eventually, they get a big log battering ram and bust down the door, and they run into the jail, and they grab out Hall English. And he leaves in a real orderly fashion. He asks for his hat, and they bind him up, and they take him out the door, and there's a big shout that comes up from the crowd. And they put him on a mule, and he's led by the little brother of the woman that was found dead in the river. And they said they're going to take him back to Roaring Creek, and that's where they're going to hang him, was the rumor. But it was getting light. It's turning into early morning light, and the lynch mob didn't want people to see him, so they ended up outside of Bakersville. They said there was 3 preachers in the group, and they asked old Hall to come clean before the good Lord and tell him, just confess and get you a clean conscience before you meet your Maker. But Hall never confessed. He went to his grave saying that he didn't murder her. Well, they put him on the mule, and they tied him with a hank of hemp. It wasn't a regular rope. It was just a little hemp rope. They didn't bring rope. That's just like our folks. We'll go to a lynching and forget the rope. Mm-hmm. But they had a hemp rope, and they put it around his neck, and the little boy was on the front of the mule while Holland English was sitting on the back of the mule. And said the testimony says, a big burly man in the crowd said, Bob, spur that mule. And when he did, the lynching occurred, and the party drifted off, and Hall English was lynched. The story goes that nobody wanted to put the body in a cemetery, so a guy by the last name of Love, donated some land, and it was this blackberry patch that he donated. He had problems with people stealing blackberries. So he figured if he buried Holland English in his blackberry patch, that his ghost would haunt those folks stealing his blackberries.
Makes sense.
Well, they said that's where he was buried. Wasn't a really marked grave, but I've been talking to some of the ancestors of Hall, and they said there's a big stone outside of Bakersfield laying on the ground that is suspected to be Hall's burial place, and the family is working towards getting a tombstone for that. And the question is with Hall, did he really do it? Was he framed? Was there jealous people? Was there other motives? We will never know. But I always say this story can rank right up there with Frankie and Johnny Silver's in the intricacies of the plot, the romance, all
the people involved.
The people involved. And it's such a story that you just don't picture people in a lynch mob breaking in a jail and you say this just happened maybe a little over 100 years ago, but it's documented on court documents. And that's what I put in the book to make sure that when relatives read this and ancestors read this, they'll know that I'm just telling the facts as history presents about all these wild happenings in the Wildest County.
That's awesome. Now, you're going to share more stories from your book during your class. Again, that is July 20th. It starts at 1 p.m. and it'll be at our Avery Learning Center. But what else are you going to discuss in that class? Just kind of give us some little tidbits of what you're going to talk
I'll
about.
definitely do that, Beth. I'm going to bring a moonshine still. It was in the family. It was, I know everybody goes back way and generations back, and I bet there's a crossover where one of your relatives might have done moonshine, might have made moonshine to make ends meet around here. A lot of times.
Or now, even.
Yeah,
Maybe.
or now. some holler way back up in the hills. You be careful where you walk. But this is a moonshine still. Kind of looks like the one if you've seen Popcorn Sutton's moonshine stills, that style. But I look at it from a historical perspective. I don't drink. I go to church, actually sing in church and all that stuff. But I love the history. The Popcorn Sutton style moonshine still, say that fast a bunch of times. Mm-hmm. Well, it is really neat in how they made it. And it's a lot of what some of these stories were built on was, moonshine stills and IRS agents coming on people's property to get them. And there was a lot of resentment about that. And it's I'm going to talk a little bit about the moonshine still when I get there, and I'm definitely going to talk about a bunch more stories that we didn't talk about today that are around this. And if you want to come, it'll be neat to share your stories. So if someone out there wants to come, share some stories. I love it. It's really neat history.
Yeah, and add to some of the documentation that you have, and maybe you can start your part 2 there.
That's
get
right.
Information while you're there.
Moonshine, Murder, and Mountaineers Part 2.
And just so the listeners know, you brought a couple of books in. I'm going to read one of them, and then I might give it away. But we do have one to give away for sure here on the air. And so we'll do that at a later time today.
Sounds good. Free books, folks, and I think you'll enjoy it. I've got a lot of feedback. You can always get on that Moonshine, Murder, and Mountaineers Facebook page if you want to preview the book. So, also, it'll tell you information about the classes. And I think, Beth, you can go through Mayland and look on their website to know when the classes are going to be.
That's right. You can get on www.mayland.edu, click on the continuing education link, and that will take you to a list of classes. And Avery County right now, and I see I've been putting the tab together for the fall, but you're going to do some in the other counties too coming up in the fall. So if you missed the Avery County one, there's some more classes, some more discussion coming up in the fall. So, but definitely check it out. July 20th, starting at 1 p.m. You can call and register at 733-5883. Get your name on the list. So we want to make sure that there's plenty of people there to enjoy the stories and the moonshine discussion. And so come out and see Alan and listen to his stories.
Yeah, come on out. Appreciate that, Beth.
And Beth, we appreciate you and Alan coming in today. And Alan, thank you for the history lesson. You're learning a lot about some of the families here in this area, and look forward to maybe hearing a few more and reading the book and seeing what all went on. I mean, it's quite interesting just flipping through it this morning, seeing the different things and the lynch mobs. I mean, you didn't realize, I guess, maybe somebody out there knows that all this took place, but, I guess you don't realize that things like this actually did take place here in the high country.
Yeah, it's really neat history, and I might have to dig into that Green family a little bit and see what was going on back in the day.
I can give you a few more names to look for, other than the Greens, I'm sure. But no, we appreciate you coming in this morning, and again, that class begins on July the 20th at 1 p.m. at the Avery Learning Center here at Mayland Community College in Avery County. And Beth, Alan, thank you again, and look forward to talking to y'all again soon.
Thank you. Have a blessed day.
Thanks for having us.